We started the unit on classical conditioning, learning about how certain stimuli can come to elicit reflexive or involuntary responses, excuse me. So classical conditioning, remember, is about learning an association between two stimuli. Now we're moving on to operant conditioning. So instead of talking about respondent behaviors, we're learning about how do we shape new voluntary behaviors in an organism. The precursor to B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning was Edward Thorndike's law of effect. So what Thorndike did essentially was to put cats into what was called a puzzle box. The cats would have to figure out how to get out of the box. And what Thorndike observed was that gradually over time, the cats would try different behaviors, maybe scratching at or clawing at something, perhaps swatting at an object in the box. But the bottom line is that any behavior that they performed that produced an outcome which helped them get out of the box is a behavior that they repeated. So we call this the law of effect or trial and error learning. The idea that a behavior that produces a desired consequence is a behavior that's going to be repeated in the future. A behavior that doesn't produce a desired consequence is going to become likely extinct. It's going to fade away over time. B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning, builds on Thorndike's idea, but discounts the notion, discounts like the mentalism of it, whereas Thorndike might focus on, the thoughts of the cat or the desires of the cat to get out of the box. Skinner completely was called radical behaviorism in the sense that it's completely discounting anything that's happening in the mind. So Skinner believed that the most powerful influences on our behavior are its consequences. So when we do a behavior, we learn to associate a particular consequence with it, and that is a powerful indicator of whether or not the behavior is going to be repeated. This is called a Skinner box, essentially an apparatus that Skinner used to test the effects of different consequences on an animal's behavior. So references to this device will come up throughout the course of the unit, but just so you know what it looks like, there would be a lever for the rat to push, lights that might indicate that maybe a food pellet is going to be dispensed, or lights that might indicate that perhaps lights that indicate perhaps that a loud sound is going to be played, and the animal might be put in a situation, for example, where the light going off predicts or signals that the loud sound is coming, and the animal might come to learn that by pushing the lever they can avoid the sound. Okay, so we're gonna learn about this a little bit more, but when you hear about a Skinner box, this is the type of thing that we're talking about. So to real quickly summarize the differences between classical and operant conditioning, and I have a whole other video on this that's further along in your notebook once we finish up both. But again, classical conditioning, we're talking about automatic, reflexive, respondent behaviors, salivating, pupil dilation, the fear response, arousal, all of those things that we talked about, right, in the first part of the unit. There is a stimulus that prompts one of those responses or behaviors. So an example would be, your dog gets sick and has to go to the vet, and perhaps when they go to the vet, it's painful, they have to get blood drawn, and now they hide every time they hear your keys rattle, because the keys rattling, they've learned to associate the keys rattling with that trip to the vet. So now the rattling of the keys becomes a conditioned stimulus that's going to prompt the dog to be afraid. Just like the unconditioned response of going to the vet would be that they were afraid. With operant conditioning, however, we're talking about an organism operating on their own environment. They're acting willfully. They're acting consciously. This is voluntary behavior, and this behavior is driven by a consequence that follows it. So, for example, your teacher gives you pop quizzes that you're going to be graded on, so you study frequently because you come to learn that if you get that pop quiz and you don't do well on it, the consequence is your grade will drop. But if you get the pop quiz and you've studied and you're prepared and you do well, your grade's going to increase. So I want you to think back to the video of the baby and the dog, right? We had two behaviors there. We had a respondent behavior and an operant behavior. Remember which was which? The baby's flinching behavior in response to the dog whining because she's learned to associate it with a bark is a respondent behavior. Whereas the dog, doing that whining sound that's going to end up in a bark in order to get access to food, which in this case is the consequence, that whining is an operant behavior. So here's where I really wanted to get to today, which is the difference between reinforcement and punishment. So these are different types of consequences. So I do a behavior, right? I exhibit a behavior, and that behavior is going to have a consequence. There's going to be something that happens after that behavior that either increases or decreases the likelihood that I'm going to repeat that behavior. A reinforcing consequence always increases the likelihood that a behavior is going to reoccur. Whether we're talking about positive or negative reinforcement, a reinforcing consequence always strengthens behavior. Whereas a punishing consequence always weakens or diminishes the likelihood that a behavior is going to reoccur. All right, so we'll talk about some examples right now. And here's the difference between positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. Whenever you see the word positive, whether we're talking about positive reinforcement or positive punishment, know that positive means we're adding something. We're giving an individual, in the case of positive reinforcement, something that they like, which we call an appetitive stimulus. Think about something you have an appetite for or something you like, right? So an appetitive stimulus. We add an appetitive stimulus when they've performed a desired behavior. So here's an example right here. We're using positive reinforcement. We want to reinforce studying behavior. So let's say in this case, the consequence of a student studying is that the teacher praises the student, assuming that teacher praise is something that's valuable, that's a valuable reinforcer for the student. The teacher praises the student as a consequence of the student studying. If that praise is a valuable reinforcer for them, that means that the student's going to study more in the future. The frequency of the behavior is going to increase. A negative reinforcer, on the other hand, and whenever you see the word negative, whether we're talking about negative reinforcement or negative punishment, I want you to think about removing. We're removing, in the case of negative reinforcement, what we call an aversive stimulus, or something that someone doesn't like as a consequence for them doing the behavior. So for example, again, the studying behavior, again, this time we're going to use negative reinforcement. This time, the negative reinforcer is going to be teacher disapproval. So perhaps the student studies in order to avoid the teacher being disappointed in them or disapproving of them. The behavior is still, again, going to increase because remember, we're talking about reinforcement. But in this case, it's increasing because the student wants to avoid a negative stimulus or an aversive stimulus, rather, of the teacher being disappointed in them.